I'm Jim Zogby, and welcome to Viewpoint. We've been witnessing an epidemic of violence in Jerusalem, Israel, and the rest of the occupied Palestinian lands. In just the last few weeks, 52 Palestinians have been killed, more than 3,400 injured by Israeli security forces and civilians, while 10 Israelis have died and 100 injured in attacks by Palestinians. What's behind the wave of violence, and is there a way to end it? For insight on this and other questions related to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, I want to welcome Khaled Elgindy. He's a fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings. Before then, he served as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership on permanent status negotiations with Israel. From 2004 to 2009, he was a key participant in the Annapolis negotiations in 2008, rather, but you were involved 2004 to 9 with the Palestinian Authority. Thanks for joining us, Khaled.
Thanks for having me.
Listen, I want to talk about some of the root cause issues. We have a number of people have been pontificating on it. Bret Stephens in the Wall Street Journal said it was a Palestinian pathology, a bloodlust. Jeffrey Goldberg, writing in The Atlantic, said, let's take a look at what he said. It was, I thought, pretty shocking. He said that it was the violence of the past 2 weeks is rooted not in Israeli settlement policy, but in a worldview that dismisses the national right of Jews. And Secretary Kerry had his own take on it. He had two distinct approaches. At first, he said that it was settlements that was at fault. He had a quote of his own in a speech at Harvard where he said, what's happening is going to keep happening until a two-state solution occurs. And then he said there's a massive increase in settlements over the last years, and now we have this violence because of the frustration that's growing. After protests, he was forced to back off, and he pointed instead to incitement coming from the Palestinian Authority and said that it needed to be condemned loud and clear. Benjamin Netanyahu had his own take on it. Let's hear from him. We have a quote from Benjamin Netanyahu.
He said the other day, I welcome every drop of blood spilled in Jerusalem. Are these the words of a moderate? He glorifies these killers. He hasn't condemned a single one of the 30 terrorist attacks on Israelis over the last month.
Give me your take on this. These are, if anything, these might be proximate causes, certainly from one point of view, that it's incitement or it's bloodlust. Palestinians have their own take on what the proximate causes are. It's what happened to the Dawabsha family, the horror of this little infant dying and burning in a fire, and the mom dying as well, burned in flames. And then there was the continued provocations at the mosque, at the Dome of the Rock, with Israeli ministers and some extremists coming up, and the chanting and the confrontations that occurred. Talk about the proximate causes. Evaluate, if you will, the Palestinian attributing this to the mosque or to the Dawabsha family.
I mean, I think you're right. There is, of course, the immediate trigger was the provocations at the Aqsa, at the Haram, as well as restrictions on Palestinian worshippers in terms of denying them access to that holy place. So that was the immediate trigger, but there are, of course, much deeper
We'll look at those
causes.
in a minute, but
yeah.
How significant were these proximate causes? I mean,
I think they're significant, but they've been building for a long time, because this sort of provocation that happens at the Haram is almost an annual event. Now you have an Israeli government that reflects the views of these kind of Temple Mount extremists that you see on the Israeli side. And so the fear on the Palestinian side is very real, because they saw what happened in Hebron, where what was seen as a Muslim shrine and holy place was essentially divided in half, and Palestinian access was limited there. And they desperately don't want to see that happen in Jerusalem.
Talk to me about the Mahmoud Abbas, accused of incitement,
Right.
saying that he hasn't exercised control. One wonders whether he can exercise control. But it almost appears the more he gets, the more inflammatory his rhetoric becomes. He hasn't been very careful these days.
He hasn't been very careful, I suppose, in relative terms. I mean, if you look at the rhetoric all the way around,
Yeah.
and on the Israeli side, there is, plenty of what can easily be called incitement happening. The Prime Minister's comparisons of the Palestinians to the Nazis, just invoking the Holocaust in reference to the Palestinians, I think is clearly a form of incitement. I think you're right. I think Mahmoud Abbas, words are the only thing that he can really control. Most of the violence is happening outside areas of his control in Jerusalem, in some cases inside Israel. And even in those flashpoints at Israeli checkpoints, they're usually in these areas that are beyond the reach of his Palestinian Authority. So he can't exercise control directly. But more importantly, I think he doesn't have real influence with the Palestinian public anymore. We saw a poll just a few weeks ago that showed an unprecedented 2/3 of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza want him to step down, to resign. That is a huge vote of no confidence in the absence, of course, of an actual election. So this is a leadership that is, its credibility and its legitimacy, I would say, is very much in question. And so it would be natural, I think, for Mahmoud Abbas to try to overcompensate with tough words. And we saw a little bit of that at the UN, and we see it now.
And Israelis say the same about Benjamin Netanyahu, that his leadership is not strong, but his rhetoric actually is used to sort of mobilize his base and give him backbone. So we have two leaders doing things that aren't helpful at this point in a situation that is ripe for disaster, and we're seeing it play out.
Absolutely. And, when it comes to Jerusalem, this is playing with fire, quite literally. We have, anytime people's holy places, especially something as central as holy places in Jerusalem, anytime there's even a perceived threat, I think it's reckless for leaders to stoke that kind of sentiment.
And you mentioned Hebron. It occurred to me when this was beginning to unfold in Jerusalem that the Hebron analogy was a good one, because it started with settlements ringing the city, then settlements inside the city, shutting down the center of the town, and people being inflamed when they see settlers walking around with armed military guards protecting them while their city is shut down, and they're powerless. And then the takeover of the mosque, first dividing it in half and then making it almost impossible for Palestinians to get in, while settlers can go in and out at will. And Palestinians, I think, fear the same thing in Jerusalem.
Absolutely. Yeah, they do. And what was
And
ironic...
so they've been chanting, Jerusalem will not be Hebron, but they can't control that.
Right. Yeah. Right. I think it's very hard. The Israelis accuse the Palestinians of exaggerating these fears. And in some cases, some of the rhetoric is definitely ahead of the reality. But it's, I think the fears are not unfounded when there's very, hard precedent for this happening in the past. And we've seen the encroachment little by little at the Haram itself since 1967. Piece by piece, bit by bit.
Let's take a look at some of that. We have a board here with some of the data about what's happening in and around Jerusalem and almost the strangling of the city. Let's put that board up if we can. 37% of the population is Palestinian. About a third of the territory has been confiscated by Israelis. 75% of that population is below the poverty level. A third of the students don't graduate from high school. More than a third aren't getting running water in their homes. Almost 40% of the houses are built without permits and are therefore subject to being demolished. And as an example, 7% of postal service in Palestinian neighborhoods only, they are without services, they're without water, they're without jobs, and it's become a city of anger and despair.
Absolutely. And I think this gets to the very heart of Palestinian frustration in East Jerusalem. The religious symbols and the provocations are an immediate trigger, but the deeper reservoir of frustration particularly inside Jerusalem for Palestinians, is what is really driving, I think, this anger. I mean, the statistics that you put out are very, very compelling, but there are other statistics that really, I think, sort of enhance that picture of isolation of Palestinian Jerusalemites, and they have, as a result, I think, a very deep sense of abandonment, certainly by Israel, which doesn't provide basic services. There are entire neighborhoods that are almost completely encircled by the wall, that don't have access either to the Palestinian Authority nor to Israeli municipal services, and they're sort of in limbo in almost every way. At the same time, you have, if you look at statistics for ID revocations, which is really a measure of residency, denial of residency rights of Palestinians, something like 14,500 Palestinians have lost their right to live in Jerusalem since 1967. More than half of them have been in the last 10 years. So we've seen really since 2000, since the second Intifada, we've seen this kind of squeeze on Jerusalem that's happening. Jerusalem institutions were shut down. Palestinian institutions in Jerusalem were shut down. As I said, the wall that isolates these neighborhoods, and they feel completely abandoned and isolated.
It's interesting. I remember the times I was in Jerusalem after the closure, about 5 so years after the closure. By then, you'd already felt the impact. The guy who was working behind the desk at the hotel had a PhD in psychology but couldn't find work.
Right.
Palestinians couldn't get into the city, and people from West Jerusalem couldn't leave the city to work, or they lose their residency, and so they became unemployed and quite despairing.
Right.
We're seeing this explode now. It's not the first time, and may not be the last time that we see this despair turning into violence. The question is, what can be done? Secretary Kerry is there wanting to return to the status quo ante, but the question is that a solution? Does it get us anywhere to go back to where we were? And then you had Ban Ki-moon. Let's hear Ban Ki-moon. There's a quote from him about his recent trip there where he's talking about wanting to reinvigorate the two-state solution. Let's hear that. Okay, Ban Ki-moon talking about the two-state solution, but the question that many ask Palestinians and Israelis is, are we even there anymore? Are there conditions for it, or are there not at this point?
Well, it's interesting because this whole question of Jerusalem, Palestinians in Jerusalem being abandoned is not just a result of Israeli policy, but it is a function of the U.S.-led peace process. As everybody knows, Jerusalem was one of these final status issues that was put off until the end. But even since the second Intifada, we've seen Jerusalem has been carved out of the peace process in ways very similar to the way Gaza has. Mm-hmm. And so things like, if you remember this thing called the roadmap of the International Quartet, they called for the immediate reopening of these Jerusalem institutions, for a settlement freeze that included settlements in Jerusalem, and none of that happened. And it was perfectly okay as far as the stewards of the peace process to ignore, this central component. So as a result, Israelis felt emboldened to kind of take Jerusalem off the table, that, if there's going to be a Palestinian state, it wouldn't include Jerusalem. And of course, that fear, Palestinians have that very same fear. So the peace process is itself guilty of sort of taking Jerusalem off the table and neglecting Palestinians in Jerusalem. So it would seem logical, I think, that if you want to reinvigorate the peace process, and I'm not sure that can be done, but if you were going to do that, you would need to start in Jerusalem. You would need to start by putting Jerusalem back on the table, maybe pushing for the reopening of these institutions that serve a very important role, that provide economic services, political, as well as kind of this psychological identity, that Palestinians have a national identity and its home is in Jerusalem. And so they've been deprived of that, and so all they can fall back on is traditional institutions like the mosque.
Here's the question I think that many are asking. Have we reached a tipping point? And I mean in two ways. One is a two-state solution even possible, number one? And number two, are we at a point where one doesn't even know where to look for leadership? Hardline leadership on Israel that doesn't show any possibility of changing to less hardline. You may get more hardline. Palestinian leadership that's become dysfunctional, and one can't even imagine how to bring that together. And international leadership that has abandoned the question. The U.S. simply hasn't moved. They've blocked the French from moving. Even if the French moved, who's going to pay attention there? The UN is paralyzed. And I'm looking at the American presidential election and I'm saying, if people thought that the current president hadn't done enough, there's really nothing on the horizon to get better. And so two tipping points. I mean, is the two-state solution over, which many ask, and two, is there any even prospect of change in the near term?
I mean, it's almost a philosophical question at this point, whether we've crossed that line of the two-state solution is no longer possible. I mean, of course, it's theoretically possible in a hypothetical world where there is that kind of leadership on both sides that is willing and able to take those necessary steps, and where you have a credible third-party mediator that is making these things happen. We don't have any of those in place. And so, and like you said, I don't see any on the horizon. When you have an American intervention or an American policy that sort of says one thing and then immediately retracts it, whether it's on settlements or on excessive use of force or any policy, and it immediately feels the need to retract it, you don't have any credible third-party mediation happening in this conflict. And I just don't see anything on the horizon to change any of the current negative trajectories that are happening. So it's very easy, I think, to conclude that it's probably not going to happen. I mean, at this point, I think it would take something close to a miracle to make a two-state solution happen, because there's so many things that have to happen on the ground to get there.
This wouldn't be the first time in history that a people were so oppressed and so despairing that they ultimately turn inward and very negative behavior sets in. One wonders if none of these dynamics change. What are we seeing 2 years down the road? What are we seeing 5 years down the road? What happens to this generation of Palestinian kids who grow up with no hope, no future? Do they, in Langston Hughes's terminology, do they explode, or do they become quiescent and turn the violence inward? That becomes, I think, the big issue.
Yeah, and of course we see examples of that around the region, of societies sort of imploding and turning on themselves.
We see the Native American experience here. You see the situation in ghettos around the country where the violence turns inward.
Right.
And the question is, where are we on this one, and why does nobody get it?
You know, I'm typically very pessimistic about the situation between Israelis and Palestinians, but on this one question, just to kind of keep it in relative terms, I have a modicum of optimism, only because I've seen Palestinians. Palestinians are incredibly talented people. They are innovative, and I think they are something of a trendsetter in the region. People talk about the Arab Spring in the early 2011. I personally think the Arab Spring began in 1987. It was really that Palestinian. It was Palestinians who took to the streets in mass mobilization to try and achieve their freedom. And it took a while for that sort of sentiment to kind of incubate elsewhere in the region. So, this can go one of two ways. It can sort of Palestinians can turn on each other, and we've seen that. We've seen this division that's torn the Palestinian national movement apart. Or I think it could go another way, which is that things get so bad that this new generation of Palestinians kind of create alternatives, that they organically create a new leadership or new mechanisms.
That to me would be the more logical, not the more logical, but the more hopeful.
Right.
And that or a mass nonviolent movement that changes the political dynamic on the ground. We're not seeing that now. There is no strategic vision, and therefore the situation is one that is not looking very promising. Although you're right, the Palestinians have been an extraordinarily resilient people, maybe resilient beyond all expectations. I mean, given what they've endured, the fact that they continue to come back hopeful is remarkable. Thanks for joining us, Khaled. That's all the time we've got right now. It's a conversation that I know we'll continue to have throughout the year. Unfortunately, the situation doesn't look like it gets better. Something for us to continue to follow. Follow us on Twitter, if you will, AAIUSA, or check out our website at aaiusa.org. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week on Viewpoint.